I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And just take a moment to sort of contemplate it. Developed motivation for our discussion today. Particularly developing bodhicitta motivation. Okay, and with that motivation, turn. So we've been studying, the Lam Rim, right, and we're in the section of the Lam Rim on the low scope, or the small, like the sort of low scope they call it, or smaller scope, right? Which, as we said at the beginning, it means. But so it's a path in common. So in other words, even if you're trying to practice a great scope, you have to practice this as well, right? Lama Tsongkhapa explained all of that very clearly at the beginning. And so, so this is sort of the scope that sort of helps us enter into spiritual practice. If we're practicing the great scope as well, right? We just develop bodhicitta. Still, we have to definitely practice this scope. And Lama Tsongkhapa wouldn't go, I won't recover it now, but Lama Tsongkhapa explained many different reasons for that. And so the section we're in, we've been going through the sufferings of the lower realms of existence. Right? And so we covered the hells, the various hot hells, the cold hells, the neighboring hells, the occasional hells, all the different kinds of hell realms. And then we talked last time also a little bit about the suffering of animals, which are which we can see with our own eyes. And on that, I won't go into that much more because we already covered that last time, but I'll just say, Lama Zopa mentions many times that if you're meditating on the suffering of the animal realm, that he points out that watching those there are very good sort of documentaries, right, that show actually the suffering of animals. Like in Buddhist texts, it's it describes, right, like the creatures that live deep under the sea and all that, but now we can actually see, right, like videos of them and so on. So you can actually, and if you watch those, like, of course, if you're meditating on the Lam Rim, you don't just look at them and think, wow, cool, right? You actually imagine, what's the word? You imagine having taken rebirth in that form, right? Like living in a rock in a dark part of the ocean, for example, right? Or living as a shark, or as a fish that's trying to swim away from a shark and all that. So you would, as you would be watching that, you wouldn't just be thinking, oh wow, look at the pretty colors. You'd be imagining sort of, wow, what would it be like if I died and tomorrow I was that kind of creature. So yeah, so that's it. Okay, But anyway, so then the last section of the last part of this section on the suffering of the lower realms is the suffering of the hungry ghosts. So we'll cover that today, and then if we finish that, it may not take that long, so we may start on refuge as well. And refuge will be a big topic. We'll spend a long time, quite a while on it. It'll take quite a while on refuge. Because in part, meditating on these sufferings of the lower realms leads us to want to take refuge in the 3 jewels. That's part of the reason for meditating on the suffering of the lower realms is to sort of, what's the word? I mean, we said earlier, it provides a basis for understanding our existential situation. It helps our understanding of our own karma. It helps us develop empathy for the suffering of others. And also it motivates us to take refuge. Okay. So next is the suffering of the hungry ghosts. And Lama Tsongkhapa starts that on page 63 for those who have the text and following along. And so the first thing here, Lama Tsongkhapa starts by saying, those who predominantly rely on miserliness are born as hungry ghosts. And then the various commentaries point out that there are many different karmic causes for being reborn in the hungry ghost realm. So one, as Lama Tsongkhapa says here, is miserliness. Others are greed. Right. So I mean, miserliness is like not wanting to give, right? Greed is wanting more for me. Right? That's greed. Covetousness, that's another one, which is like wanting what other people have, right? Which is a state of mind, right? All of these are, you get that all these are mental states, right? They're not, right? So they're all like, and you can see how they're all similar, but they're different also, right? Like if I think, oh, that person has such a nice car, I wish I could have that, right? That's different from greed, sort of feeling I want everything. I want to be the richest person, whatever. And that's different than miserliness, right? Where you see somebody in need and you feel, I don't want to give to them, like, I want it for me. And then also stealing is another cause of rebirth in hungry ghosts, right? And sometimes they say, for example, like you know, so in life, when we have those states of mind, we're cultivating, let's say it, like a cause for rebirth in the hungry ghost. Does that make sense? That's the idea, right? So it's this kind of mind that's like grasping. So then Lama Tsongkhapa makes a general point. He says, so in general, these kinds of beings, so just to be clear, right, because a ghost implies it, right, so like hungry ghosts are, let's just say it, it's a rebirth. Does that make sense? So it's not like, sometimes the word ghost can imply to Western context, like, oh, someone who died. But remember, from a Buddhist point of view, we're all, I like, I think Bob Thurman once said, everyone dies, but no one's dead. Like, the point being, like, everybody dies, right? But you are the person who died. Like, whereas you die and then you take rebirth. If you believe in reincarnation, right? It's like nobody stays dead in that sense, right? After death, you take rebirth, either as in some realm, right? Hell realm, hungry ghost realm, animal realm, human, and so on. So in other words, you are. In other words, like sometimes we think, oh, what happened? Like, what happened to so and so? It's like, well, you are somebody. Actually, you are so and so. You were somebody, and now you're you. Later, you'll be somebody else. So the hungry ghost realm isn't like, it's a rebirth. In other words, so you die, you go through the intermediate state, and you take rebirth in this hungry ghost realm. And the bodies of those beings are different than our bodies, right? So it's describing here. So he says, first of all, in that realm, you're always hungry and thirsty. And then he describes kind of what the body looks like. And they go into more detail in some of the commentaries, but it says, so beings in that realm, their bodies look like dried up wood. Like, you know, like how like wrinkled, dried wood looks. Like not like a fresh tree, but like, you see like a dead old tree with like deep grooves. It's saying that the body's like that, very dry looking. They have a body that's shaped like a sentient being, but it's got like the skin looks like dry wood with big sort of wrinkles in it and dryness. And they've got a lot of hair on their body. This is just their descriptions. And then it says, oh, the face is covered with hair, their mouths are very dry, they lick their tongue, they're licking their lips a lot. And then it's, in other commentaries it goes on to explain, it says also that they tend to have, let's just say it like, very big bodies and small limbs, so it's hard for them to move around. They almost have to like drag themselves places. Like, and some of them have very long necks or something like that. Like, so they don't look quite like human. They look, you know, you could recognize them as sentient beings, but they're not. It's not like that's something like what their body looks like. So the implication being, first of all, like what's sort of unpleasant, unattractive, sort of, and also just sort of hard, difficult with mobility. I guess that's what you're saying. And so then, in the commentaries it also says, and their place, they can travel various places, but they sort of have a, it's like their natural habitat. Maybe that's the way of saying it. Like, you know, like how creatures can have a natural habitat, and they can also go elsewhere. So it says their natural habitat is kind of, it describes it in some text, kind of like a wasteland. Like a place with drought, like, you know, if you imagine like, when they do the descriptions, I was reading it, and I was thinking, oh, it's like a place with a horrible drought, that's had a horrible drought for decades or something. It looks kind of like that, so like dusty and craggy, you know, with rocks and crags and not much, you know, nothing growing, sort of like that. You know, dust, like a dust bowl, you know, say the dust bowl or something like that. Are the descriptions in the text of their natural habitat. And sometimes they travel elsewhere looking for food and drink. Okay, so then it describes almost like this is a realm, right? But so in the realm of animals, there are many different types of animals. So now in the realm of hungry ghosts, it describes 3 different categories of hungry ghosts with 3 different kinds of problems. So the first are those with external obstructions to food and drink. And Lama Tsongkhapa covers that in his text. So, so in that, so the ones with this type of obstacle, right? And again, this is born from those kinds of karma, right? So the being takes rebirth in this realm. So the ones with this type of karma, basically their experience is like, if you imagine somebody in the desert who sees a mirage and goes towards it, and then they get there and there's nothing. So like imagine, so these kinds of beings, they're terribly thirsty, right? And they're sort of wandering through this wasteland, and they have some appearance in the distance, like, oh, it looks like a lake, or it looks like a pond, or it looks like a stream or something. And they sort of drag themselves over there, right, because it's hard for them to move. And when they finally get there, and actually here Lama Tsongkhapa does briefly, but in the commentaries explains there are 3 different kinds of appearances that can happen. One is the mirage light, so it looks like there's some beautiful lake there. They drag themselves there, they feel like they're dying of thirst, and they get there and it's just dry, right? And they're sort of like, oh, you can imagine the feeling. The second one, as Lama Tsongkhapa mentions here, is where they get there and they find it's like protected by, he says here, beings with swords, spears, and lances. That basically it's like a, say if you imagine being a poor wanderer, and then you see something that looks beautiful, but you find out it's a, what's the word? Hotel resort, and they throw you out. It's like kind of like that, right? They have guards, you know, and it's like, this isn't for you, get lost. And you're weak and sort of powerless, and you have no choice, right, so you have to move on. So that's the second kind of, in this category, that's the second sort of obstruction to getting the food and drink externally. And the third that sometimes happens is where, again, like they have this appearance, they get there, think, oh, it'll be something, I'll finally get some sustenance. And then when they get there, instead of finding a clean pond, they find is something that's like kind of like sort of, the description of the text says pus and blood, or something like some disgusting gook instead of water. On that point, there's an interesting, I'll just pause there. It's interesting, in some Buddhist texts they talk about, actually in the Lamrim, in another Lamrim text, the Tsongkhapa mentions that in his Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand. So he mentions, like, he gives the example of a glass of water, right? And he says, it depends on your karmic appearance. So he points out, for a human being, something will appear like a glass of water. And he says, if you're in the God realm, that same base will appear to them as nectar, as some kind of divine nectar. He says, then if a hungry ghost sees that, because of their karma, it will appear something like pus. Like some kind of disgusting, smelly pus. And he says, and he points out, he says, because it depends on the karma of the beings, right? And you have to pause and say, so, you know, It's an interesting question. Can we imagine what's nectar? Right? Like, so actually, if I say the word nectar, I guess, you know, if you grew up in the U.S., you might have some association to, like, when you were, how old, 8 or something, you studied Greek myths, right? Oh, the gods drank nectar. Right? It's the same idea in a way. But actually, we can, I mean, I don't know, can we imagine what that is, right? And then you say, can you imagine, like, pus and blood? I guess I would take it also as a, they're trying to describe a human thing that's the most similar to what those beings would experience. Right? Because if you're in a different realm, you experience that base, or those molecules, whatever you want to call them, but differently, right? And that's true even if you look at animals, right? They experience the same base differently than a human might. For example, like flies in an ocean poop, right? They experience poop differently than we do. So it's like that, you know, you have a different kind of sensory apparatus in this realm, so you experience things differently. But so this first general, so that's the idea, is it's the karma of the being that they sort of experience. They have a sort of, their mind and body experience the environment in a different way than other beings' minds and body experience it, which makes sense. I mean, we can even see that among humans and among animals, that's true. But so you can imagine, so you get this idea of this first category, right? So this first category of hungry ghosts, it's like their suffering is that they see something they want, but they can never get it. And they are always like, searching. And they spend their whole life sort of dragging themselves around and always being sort of terribly, like thirsty and hungry, but also disappointed. Just pause for a moment. So when we do this, we'll do a retreat on this, right? Then, well, so you'd imagine yourself in that form, right? And then you sort of get back out there and you're dragging yourself again, sort of looking. You're always either, right, and every time you get somewhere, it's either mirage and there's nothing, or they throw you out, you have to keep going, or you have some sort of putrid appearance and then you have to keep going. But you never get satisfaction. Any questions about that first one? You get the idea of that. So then the second type of hungry ghost of these three categories, I'll just read. So Lama Tsongkhapa says they have mouths like the mere eye of a needle. Their mouths blaze with fire. They have goiters and big bellies. Even if they do end up finding food and drink, without others creating obstructions, they themselves are not able to eat or drink them. And just to go into a little more detail, so this second type of hungry ghost, it's called internal obstruction in the sense of their own body. It's not that their problem, they also sometimes can't find things outside, but their main problem is that their own body is, what's the word, like blocking them. And there are some descriptions of, so like he says here, like having this tiny, you can imagine like a mouth like the eye of a needle, right? They can't take anything, they can't take in the sustenance. Other descriptions describe like how some of them have, what's the word, like blockages, like their throat or their digestive system is sort of tied in a knot, and so nothing can go through. I'll share. I wasn't sure I would say this, but actually I can empathize with that. I was, apparently my mom told me I was born with, I had to have an operation as an infant. I was born, I think if I had died, I would have been this kind of hungry ghost. So I think that's where I would have taken rebirth. I had some kind of obstruction that needed an operation where I couldn't digest. Like, so my mom, she thought I was an infant, right? I was born that way. She would give me food, and I would like vomit it up, and then she, she's a very nurturing person, so she wanted to do that always. Like, she'd be very giving, but whatever she would give me, I would like throw up, and she had to like. And then the doctor said, "Oh, you're a first-time mother. Don't worry about it. You're just being nervous." And then finally, she found the doctor who said, "Oh, he's about to die if you don't have an operation. He'll die in a few days from lack of nutrients." So I can always empathize with this kind of hungry ghostness. I always think, oh, if she hadn't saved my life, I would have been reborn as that kind of ghost. I must have had a lot of karma like that. But so like the idea of having so it's like either having the mouth like that or having your organs tied up so that you can't digest. Did you have that too?
Yeah, my older brother too.
Oh, wow. Common. Stenosis of some kind.
Yeah. There's two kinds, pyloric and...
I had the pyloric. Yeah. So anyways, that's that. So they have so these hungry ghosts are born, but they can't have an operation. And so they stay like that, but they don't die. They just suffer. Right? And then the third kind are those with obstructions to the food and drink itself. So this is again different. The first one, they can't find it, right? The second one, their body can't take it in. And the third one, they can take it in, or they do take it in, but the food itself turns on them. I sometimes think this one is like, from the description here, you can almost think like one type is almost like, if you have like severe, what's it called? Like, what's that called when you get like reflux? Like that burning, right? Where some people like, they eat and then they can't, like they have severe pain, they can't lay down, they can't, right? Imagine like a realm or a kind of existence where that's your main experience. So it describes that. So it says some get burned just by eating or drinking, right? So it's like they, wherever they eat or drink, instead of getting satisfaction, it's like they have severe pain. That's one type. Others are filth eaters, where the only type of sustenance they can take is, it says, excrement or urine, or unhealthy, disgusting things. You know, so if you imagine, like, and again, we can empathize with this if we imagine, like, if you imagine there are people who, one is you can imagine having horrible reflux, right? So it's like that, only an entire realm, where your experience of life is only that. Or the other is like, what's it say it, like, and we know people can only eat excrement or urine, but there's like a thing of, what's it say it, like, somebody who has some kind of digestive problem where it's like what they can eat becomes more and more restricted to things they hate, or something like that, right? But this would be much more than that. I'm just giving an analogy. Right? Whereas so that all they can eat are things that are horrible to them, or disgusting to them, but they have no choice. It's either that or nothing. Right? And it says some, again, these descriptions are horrific. Then it says some even cut their own flesh and eat it. They cannot make any use, they don't have any karma to make use of clean food or drink. So their karma is such that they can't take in something that would be satisfying and clean and nurturing. Is only either this fiery kind of experience or disgusting things. So those are the three general types of hungry ghost experience. And then Lama Tsongkhapa describes the length of time and so on. So he goes on to describe a little bit this thing about they have their own place, which is this kind of wasteland. And then he gives lengths of time. And he says one of their days is like a month to humans, and they live for 500 years, but some can live up to 5,000 or 10,000 years. So basically their lifespan, if you put it into human years, would be, remember the hell realm, some of them were like billions of years. These would be, the 500 years of their years would be like 15,000 human years, so up to 150,000. If you translate what he said, if you do the math, it would be somewhere between 15,000 and 150,000 human years would be their lifespan. So like imagine, right, that's what we're imagining. So, wow, imagine taking rebirth where that's my experience for 150,000 years. And more, actually, I'll just pause there to say something, which is, you know, if you really contemplate this, actually, it's a bit like, again, I use this analogy sometimes, but it's a bit like Dickens's Christmas Carol, right? Like, I mean, if you think of Scrooge, I mean, you know, we're trying to get in touch with our own inner Scrooge-like inside, and say, okay, in what way am I miserly and greedy, right? And then we think, okay, I'll take rebirth like that for that long. And in a way, it's like looking at our own mind. You know, looking at our own mind and how we're sort of, what's the word? We're closed off and we're grasping and we're right to find those parts of ourself, and then to realize that's where this is. Those parts of ourself lead us in this kind of direction. And if we, by meditating on this, you start to develop, what's the word? An aversion, an appropriate aversion to having that kind of mind, right? So then when you see yourself, which we all have, maybe, you know, like, actually, maybe we all have the seeds of this, right? The seeds for being able to be miserly or greedy or grasping or overly attached. And by the way, this overly attached, right? It can be with money. It can also be, right? I mean, if you think about this dynamic, it's a state of mind, right? So for some people that's money. For other people it's their stuff, you know, like whatever, like their things. For others it's like people's attention, right? I want all the attention for me, or I want people to, I want everybody to like help me or look, you know, nurture me, and I don't want to really give to others. I want everybody to pay the attention to me. I don't want to give others. And, you know, there are all different versions of this. It doesn't have to only be. It could be food, right? That kind of grasping. So they're all different versions of that, but by looking at our own mind, part of the idea is that we see ourselves, we look for ourselves, we look introspectively, right? We try to see, in these moments when I become like that, right, that I'm creating a karmic seeds to be a hungry ghost, right, or create karmic cause, and also that you start to develop, by thinking of this kind of teaching, right, the idea is that you develop almost like a fear, in a way, an appropriate fear or aversion for, like, oh, I don't want to be like that. I want to be generous. I want to be open. I want to be open-hearted. I want to be giving, a giving sort of person, right? And when you catch yourself being overly attached to things, right, whatever they are, whether it's from other people's attention or your own stuff or whatever, you can meditate on the hungry ghost realm. Does that make sense? As an antidote. And the last thing he says here is their bodies are all different. It says Lama Tsongkhapa points out that according to different texts, that the size of beings' bodies in the hungry ghost realm can vary. So they can be much larger, and so on. Which I guess the idea would be it would create more suffering. The bigger, if you're sort of, there's more space, there's more feeling of emptiness, right? More feeling of wanting and more to fill up or something. That's always feeling dissatisfied. So just pause there for a moment. Like, do people get, I don't know, anything? I mean, it's a pretty, it's a brief presentation of the hungry ghost realm. Any questions or comments about it?
For number 2, where you're having the internal obstruction to food and drink, would that be kind of similar, like say when someone has the flu and they want to eat and they're hungry and they knew they're going to throw up, or
yeah,
it makes them sick and think about food? I mean, is that the same idea?
So I guess that would be similar. Yeah, that would probably be similar. It seems like. I mean, so yes, as a basis for empathy, yeah, that would be a good way to, of course it's a different level of suffering, but but it would be like, yeah, that would be a basis for empathizing. Like, wow, what's that like? Yeah.
We make the stay shorter so that they don't need to go through such a long time, like 5,000 years.
Do they what?
Can they kill themselves so they can go through the next birth quickly?
The idea seems, from the descriptions of this realm, like they describe the suffering, and it just sounds like they can't, it's like their karma doesn't end and they can't leave it. Or they can't die, even if they go on a hunger strike, they just keep living, for example. It's like, and they just suffer.
It's true of all the realms. I mean, there are karmically determined lengths of life in each realm, including the human realm.
Yeah. So yeah, the idea is you can't get out of this realm until your karma is finished.
Yeah. Sometimes you read stories about houses which are haunted by ghosts. Those ghosts are not the same as the hungry ghosts. Seems to me they are different realms and different.
The idea, like when they talk about, I know what you mean, like spirits or ghosts or something. Usually, what they talk. This is a question I've asked some Tibetan lamas, and they say that some of those beings might be from the 6 realms, according to the Buddhist presentation. There are 6 different realms, right? What they say is that disturbing spirits like that disturb a house or disturb a person or something. Of course, Tibetan Buddhist lamas would say they definitely exist, But usually what they say is some of them are in the hungry ghost realm, but some are in the demigod, or the Ashura, so the anti-god or demigod realm. And it says, so it depends. Some of them are different. They could be in the demigod realm, or they could be in the hungry ghost realm. I think if it's bothering a house like that, it would be one of those 2 realms. Some people are also disturbed by beings in the God realm, I think, but I think that wouldn't be this kind of thing. I think, from my understanding at least, it would be either the demigod realm or this hungry. Some of them could be hungry ghosts, though, who have some, and also some animal realm, like nagas, for example, which are like serpent spirits. They say they're in the animal realm, but you can't see them. So that's another kind of spirit that can bother people. So they would say actually they could be in different realms. So hungry ghosts could be, but also animal realm, also demigod realm. That there are many different types of spirits.
They could also be bardo beings, right?
I don't think bardo beings don't tend to bother humans, as far as I know. I've never heard that, at least. Maybe they do, but I've never heard that so far.
So,
Oh, are you were next?
Yeah, go ahead.
oh, thanks. So should the number of years that the lower realms suffer seems to be a lot longer as you're lower. So should we interpret that to mean that we're lucky that we're actually having to be in this realm for a shorter time? Because it seems that the more severe or the lower you are, then your suffering is a lot longer. So would we consider that a blessing, or that in fact it's good that we're suffering as humans in a shorter period of time?
Sometimes they think that, yeah. Sometimes they do think that, actually. I mean, sometimes people say that, yeah. Like, I mean, one thing, well, actually, later in the text we'll get to this. Like, they say that the God realms also have very long lives. Actually, the beings in the God realms also have very long lifetimes. But they do sometimes say, like, if you suffer like, as a human being, if we're going through suffering, like, actually, sometimes Lama Zopa say things like that. It's, compared to, like, like somebody will say, oh, I'm going through this, or something, and like sometimes you can see where Rinpoche's like, oh, compared to, like, you're so lucky compared to that, so compared to the experience there, it's not like that's, it becomes, like, I think also, like, the Tibetan Lamas I know, it seems to me, that from what they've said, like, so say, if they've meditated a lot on this kind of realms, that it gives a kind of a bravery or a kind of a strength in the face of suffering. Like, of course we have some bad experiences, but it's not like last night I was reading actually Lama Zopa in his Transforming Problems. He was sort of saying he was teasing Westerners or something, but he was saying something like some people, like, they even just a little bug bites them and they get quite upset or something, or if they're in a hotel and he was saying, like, then a bug bites them, then they get, like, really freaked out or something, and then he's saying, like, oh, people that sometimes we can exaggerate the importance of the magnitude of a human suffering. And then he says, if you put it in the context of samsara, of the nature of samsara, then you reckon, first of all, it's in the nature that we have a samsaric body, of course we're going to suffer, and it becomes less important or something. Like, what's important is cultivating bodhicitta, cultivating the view of emptiness, cultivating the path of the Lam Rim, and so on, right, the whole path. And those other things seem quite small then or something. And there's a verse, like, there are many teachings like that, but there's a verse in the Vajracutter Sutra where it says, like, if you do this practice, if you meditate on the teaching of the Vajracutter Sutra, it says, then it kind of says something like, then you will suffer. But some suffering, like, you'll purify, what it's saying is that you'll purify the karma of, like, say, what would have been a rebirth in hell with just some little bit of a cold or a headache or and it says, and be happy, like you're purifying your karma. So that's similar to what you're saying.
Part of the whole point is that we can learn from our suffering. Right? Yeah. As a human being, we can learn and process our suffering. In the other realms, that doesn't occur. It is simply suffering. But the unique part of the human rebirth is that we can use the suffering to grow.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so the Hungry Ghost realm, it's just meaningless, thousands of years of misery. Whereas for us, we can learn empathy, we can learn compassion, we can learn renunciation, we can learn about karma from our suffering. Yes, that's a huge difference.
Also, Dr. Lauren, like, of my understanding, most of the stuff in Buddhism is, when you talk about time, the understanding is very different than what time we're talking about here. We're talking aeons and aeons, and time itself is like neither permanent nor impermanent. It's like habits, one of those things, right? And I also see that in one of the books, His Holiness says about getting enlightenment in this instance, right? That instance itself means the entire lifetime of it.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
Yeah, so we need to understand time in that perspective as well. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody in the back also had a comment, or did you?
Yeah, so when we talk about hauntings of different houses and people and whatever, and there seems to be different levels of hauntings, one of them being demons. And we don't really study that in Buddhism, so how does Buddhism explain the haunting of demons, I guess, or by demons?
That was, I've asked, again, like, it's a topic I'm a little bit interested in, so I asked questions like that to different lamas. And what they said was that they were saying, so for example, that, like what, You know, because there are different terms actually. Like in other words, what we what's sometimes translated as demon, you know, which is a reasonable translation. Like, so there are like these different creatures. So there are like in Sanskrit they have this like yakshas and rakshas and nagas and other listed beings like bhutas and so there are many different like categories. I mean, and they have long lists of like. Actually, if you ever study, it's funny. I mean, Tibetans have, because I mean, India had this tradition too. And then, I mean, if you study, I was actually looking at recently, from ancient India, the Puranas have descriptions of these of these kind of beings. And then, of course, in Tibet, they had a long history of shamanism that had descriptions of different kinds of beings that they sort of fit their own. Tibetans, this was my own impression, is that historically, I think, when Buddhism came from India to Tibet, I think Tibetans had their own, almost like demonology or something, and then they had to fit it, they sort of fit it into the terms from ancient India. You know, so they would say, oh, this spirit must be a yaksha because it's acting like the one Indian descriptions, and so on. So there are all these different kinds of, and you know, if you do these certain practices, it'll say like, you'll do offerings to like local landlords and yakshas and rakshas and kinnaras and maharagas and nagas, and there are all these different descriptions of many different kinds of beings, and so some of those beings would be translated in English as demon, for example. Like a reasonable translator might use that term. That's not an inaccurate term, really, particularly for English. You have to find some word. So the issue that you're raising, though, is like. Is an interesting one. So, you know, I've asked that question. So what realm if you go through the 6 realms, what realm are they in, right? And the answer seems to me, from the lamas I've spoken to be that those different beings are in different, like, obviously they're not human, but that some of them are hungry ghosts, that are like malevolent hungry ghosts. Some of them are demigods, actually, or jealous gods, we sometimes say, who are kind of who are certain. And I guess, you know, part of the idea would be, like in the description of the realms, if you think of it's like, you know, there are the main, it's like if you say hungry ghost realm, right? So we went through these 3 types of hungry ghosts. But my impression when I talk to the lamas, or I've asked questions about this, is that, like if you were to describe the animal realm, like in the section on the animal realm, it says there are animals in the ocean, there are animals in the land, some animals are beasts of burden that are used by humans, some animals are killed by humans, some run and hide. You know, it gives a general description, right? But it doesn't describe, it doesn't go into detail describing like, alligators as compared to tigers, as compared to, like it doesn't go into every detail. So the impression I've gotten is that it's like that, in a sense, that some of the beings in the hungry ghost realm are these other kinds of creatures that a human might experience as demonic influence, but also some demigods are like that, where their particular karmic tendency is to harm humans for some reason. And so it said that there are quite a few beings that would be in the demigod realm, particularly. But not all, because again, like they said, you know, definitely some can be in the animal realm, some can be in the hungry ghost realm, and then some are in the demigod realm. But that are like sort of rageful, malevolent, you know, for whatever reason, they're kind of malevolent beings who want to harm others. So it seems to be that those beings that we would call demons are actually could be in different realms from their own side. Is the answer I've heard. Is that?
Yeah.
Jeff.
Lama's told me once that that every illness, every human illness is accompanied by a spirit harm. The mechanism, the cosmic mechanism of an illness in a human being is a spirit harm. Where do you think those spirits would reside?
I have no idea. I really don't have any idea. I've never heard. I don't know. So yeah, I've just been. Do you know? You have an idea? I have no idea.
No, it's. I mean, I think what you said before, demigods and hungry ghosts make sense. it's not inconceivable to me that some of them are human and some of them are gods.
Well, they also say, I mean, for example, disease. There's some. I've read at least Lama Zopa saying some diseases are caused by nagas, for example, too.
Mm-hmm.
So, and those are animal realm definitely. So I don't, so it may be different. It must be different realms. Then it would be the Buddhist. I think the Buddhist answer would be that they're in different realms.
So there are formless animals, right? Are the nagas formless?
No, they have a form, just not a form that ordinary people like. They would say they're not formless, not a visible form, but they have a form. Not a visible form to humans, but they have a form, according to Buddhism. Just like the hungry ghosts have a form, but it's not visible to ordinary human beings. Some humans can see hungry ghosts, but they can't.
I had a question, Dr. Lara. So one of the Hinayana scripture I came across, actually they go vividly describing about animal realms, saying if you were to do this, you'll become a swan. If you were to do this, you'll become this. Is there anything on Mahayana side of stuff equivalent to that, or do we say that we don't believe in it? I mean, it's pretty vivid in terms of if you're greedy and such and such and such, and this would be your animal equivalent, and so on and so forth.
I mean, there are scriptures that give. It doesn't really say, I mean, the ones that, maybe there are scriptures like that, I'm not sure. I mean, the ones I've read myself, like, I can only share what I know, like, there are quite a few scriptures that describe, like, for example, like, that describe, not, the ones I've read, or maybe there are some in Tibetan that I haven't read, but the ones I've read don't say, if you do this, you'll exactly be that, but they tell stories, like, there are many scriptures that tell stories of, a being who is this, and they're, like, where the Buddha said. The Buddha would come across some being, and it was actually in sutras, right? Like the Sutra of the Wise and the Foolish, for example. And it'll say, oh, this person did this in a past life, so they became that, and that's how come they have this particular suffering, and so on. So it's similar in that sense that one is supposed to take those teachings, not just to say, oh, that person had that experience, but to say, oh, if I do similar. Say there was one, right, the stories of somebody who, there are even stories in Tibetan also, right? Somebody, like, a monk who's, like, whatever, who took more of the communal resources and was very attached, and then he took rebirth as a hungry ghost, but he had like a little bit of cloth color of monk's robes on him, and somebody saw him and said, why is he like that? And they said, oh, he was a monk, but he did that. So, like, there are many stories like that, but I don't, I'm not sure if there's a scripture that's exactly like that one.
I had a hard time believing it when I read it. It's in Sanskrit, so it's from a Pali tradition.
And I don't know.
And to some extent, I've started doubting a lot of things on that end.
Yeah, I don't know that one. So
there are also popular stories that a lot of the dogs that hang around monasteries are former monks who fell, and the rebirth they took as a dog.
So, Lauren, what's the relationship between karma and these creatures, like a naga causing you illness? Is that your karma that the naga is there? Or are they somehow intervening? Or?
Yeah, so the main cause of any problem is karma, according from Buddhist point of view.
Yeah.
So the idea would be like, so there are many teachings like that say, so for example, like if you harm somebody in a past life, and then let's say they're in a naga realm, and you happen to be in the human realm now, and you come across them, and then there are stories like that. So the person in a past life created some negative karma in relation to that being. Now let's say I'm a born human, they're born as the naga, and then I do again some action of polluting near them and disturb them, and they notice me, and then there's a negative karmic connection, and so then they can harm. That's usually the kind of example that's given. So that there has to be a negative, whereas they can't harm. If there's no negative karma, then they can't harm you actually. So the idea would be that there's always some, and then there's a whole teaching also in Tibetan, in Buddhism, but Tibetans teach it, called like karmic debt, where you have a karmic debt to a certain being you took from them, or in a past life you did something like you took their resources, or you imprisoned them, or so let's say if I harmed this certain being in a past life, that there's a kind of karmic debt between us, and then if I come across that being, then whether it's like if they're a certain kind of being, maybe causes disease, if they're a different kind of being, they sometimes say that if they're, you know, or they make, like suddenly your house gets invaded by something and starts eating your, or your food starts suddenly, there are creatures eating your food in your house, or, you know, they're eating your house or whatever. And they would say that's a sign of a karmic debt from a past life to those beings. So then, you know, whatever, like, so I have this, so I feel like, oh, this is my resource, but then they're taking it away or something, or using it in that way that's harming me. So those would be examples of the karmic, that Tibetan, at least according to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, where they would say that's an example of where it's a negative karmic relationship from a past life. And if you repay the karmic debt, then that will be finished and it'll sort of pass. One thing on that topic, one thing Lama Zopa pointed out to me once, but he was saying that oftentimes what we do, of course, is that, so like, let's say that happens, right? So some being starts to harm, I owe them a karmic debt, so they start to harm me. And then, of course, oftentimes we harm them back, right? So like, you give the example, like if, so somebody's growing crops, and then these suddenly like creatures come and start eating their crops, which is a karmic debt. It's not, and then we kill them, right? Which is creating another karmic debt, and then it just keeps the karma going. And he's saying, so that's not helpful karmically, in a sense. You know, or he's giving, like, so you have, let's say, like roaches come, and then you kill them all, and then you're creating more karma with those beings. So it continues on from life to life, is what he was pointing out. And he was saying, so the best is to not harm them again, because then it doesn't keep that going, but to be kind to them, right? So that's why Lama Zopa has all these things that, like, now I'm getting off from spirits, but he has all these things like little mantra things to capture little insects and pray for them and take them outside, so you're not hurting them. He gives that's an example like that. But the same would apply if it was a spirit harming. He would say, like, they say, well, do practices to make offerings to the spirits then, or something. And say, you know, I'm sorry, I have a karmic debt to you. Here's some offering. Please don't bother me. Something like that. Is there many practices like that where it's like you're trying to practice generosity then instead of harming them, instead of, because that's, you know, because the idea that you're trying to finish the negative karma and create a positive karma in relation to, again, whether it's humans or animals or spirits. That'd be the, you know, Buddhist suggestion, I guess. Does that answer?
Dr. Lama, I had a question about, our friend asked earlier about spirits, like haunted spirits and houses and stuff like that. So as a Buddhist, we believe in that? Like,
I mean, Buddhists believe that, I guess, you know,
like
if you look
they can
at,
come and disturb us, and, you know, we can't go in that house, and all those, you know, TV serial stuff.
Oh, that's, but I mean, I don't know if Buddhists believe exactly in a TV show or something, but I mean, really, Buddhism believes that. Really, the simple answer is this: Buddhists believe that there are so many different kinds of beings and so many different realms, some of which we can see, some of which we can't see, and that you can actually have positive or negative relationships to any. You know, so like whether it's animals, like we can have a positive relationship to animals, or, you know, we're like you see that, right, where somebody has, let's say, birds and they're feeding them, and they are so happy to have the birds come to their yard, and it's wonderful. Or they can have a negative, right, like what's it called, that eat your house. What are the ones like mice or termites or something? You know, where the person's upset by it, right? That both are possible, and they would say the same is true with hungry ghosts or gods or demigods or anti-gods, whatever. You know, jealous gods. You know, is that you can have a positive relationship to them where they help you, or you can have a negative relationship to them where they harm you, and both are, all that's possible depending on your karma. You're just depending on your karmic relationship to them.
Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
So you need to have that propensity to see them and get disturbed and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and if you don't have karma, then that won't happen. If you have some negative karmic relationship, then you can have some problem. So then, kind of concluding this section, Lama Tsongkhapa says, and I'll just read this one line, because I thought he says, now he's finishing the whole section on the suffering of the lower realms, and he says, so in accordance with that, when you think of the sufferings of the lower realm, reflect like this: it would be difficult for me to sit for one day with my hands stuck in embers, or just stay in a freezing cave during a winter storm without clothes, or to be without food and drink for a few days, or have my body bitten by something like a gadfly. How could I bear the sufferings of the hot hells, the cold hells, the hungry ghosts, and the animals who devour one another alive? You should meditate evaluating such experiences until a change of mind, of intense fear or terror occurs. So, he's saying to do what we've been doing, what you guys have been doing. We've all been doing that together, right? Where we sort of try to imagine our own experiences and then empathize, right? We say, what we say, right? So, what's it like if you feel really sick, or what's it like if you're, have whatever severe gastroenteritis, or, I think you sort of use that as a metaphor or a basis to empathize with beings from another realm. So he's saying meditate through empathy, right? Imagine, what he's saying is, wow, I couldn't even, it's true, right? I mean, he says for a day, actually 1 second, right? And I'd be completely freaked out, and then he's saying, so use that as a basis and empathize and imagine the experience of these other beings until you feel it, right? Until you feel some experience of how horrific that is. So that's his advice, right? That's his advice for practice. And then he says, and based upon that, make this precious human rebirth as meaningful as possible. Right? That's the point. So in other words, by understanding that not all beings have this kind of experience, which is clearly true, that's no mystery there, right? That not all beings have the kind of experience you're having. He says, by meditating in this way, you'll develop an intensity of focus of wanting to take the essence of your life and make it meaningful by practicing the path. Does that make sense? So he's saying that's the purpose of all of this. It's not to torture yourself, obviously. It's not to just be depressed or something. It's to develop a kind of intensity of focus on your spiritual practice. Any more questions before I move on? Because it flows right into the next section, which is refuge. But any questions about that? And maybe I'll say, I think maybe what we'll do, if we've been doing this thing over, when we finish the section, we do a meditation day, a 3-hour, sort of mini retreat on it. So I think maybe what we'll do is the first session in March. In February, we'll keep going on refuge and just covering that. But I think that in March we'll just do that session on the suffering in lower realms, and then by the end of March we'll maybe finish refuge or something like that, or by April sometime finish refuge. Does that sound okay? And so then what Lama Tsongkhapa says is the next session, explaining how to rely on the methods for happiness of future worlds. Right. So what he's saying is, having considered all the sufferings of the lower realms, now comes the actual practice of the in common with the lesser scope, right? Which is, how do you not take rebirth there? How do you get yourself free from that? Right? And the point is, that he said earlier, is even if you're trying to become a Buddha for all sentient beings, well, you still need to not go there, because if you go there, you're not going to be able to practice the spiritual path, right? If you say, I want to become a Buddha and practice the Bodhisattva path, well, if you don't keep yourself from falling into a hungry ghost realm, forget about becoming a Buddha, you're going to just be miserable for 15,000 years, right? Or something that's a total waste of opportunity to be of help to others and to practice the path, so don't fall there, right? And so he's saying, so how do you do that? So that comes the next session, which he says, there are 2 points for that. One is taking refuge, and the other is what he calls the root of all well-being, which is understanding karma. Right? So there is by not creating the cause of the karma. One is taking refuge, and the other is not creating the karmic causes for that. Does that make sense? So now he goes into refuge, and how to all this many different points about refuge. And so refuge. He goes through it in quite detail, and I think we should go through it in a lot of detail, because it's a very, very important topic. Actually, I was going to pause and say a couple of things from Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche said about it. Khyentse Rinpoche says, this practice of refuge is extremely important and beneficial. And then he goes. I mean, Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't mention these things, right? These are like sort of introductory comments from Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche. Where one thing he says when Atisha, right, who wrote the first Lam Rim, we talked about Atisha, right? He said when Atisha came to Tibet, he talked so much about refuge that people gave him the nickname Refuge Lama. Like, instead of saying the great Atisha, they would just say, "Oh, are you going to hear Refuge Lama talk again?" or something, because he would talk so much about it. And he said when Atisha heard he had that nickname, he was extremely happy. He said, like, because there's no better compliment than calling me that, because it's the best topic. And then he said, he makes this point. He says, Khenchen Rinpoche tells the stories of a number of different yogis in Tibet who had like the ability to achieve some kind of great realization, some kind of high level of concentration, let's say, concentration meditation. And then he says, and instead of focusing on that, they focused on refuge. And he says, and that was very wise of them, because refuge is more important than some high level of concentration. And then he says that Atisha's famous student, Lama Dromdonpa, said that if he compared somebody who was a great scholar, like who understood many different topics, and somebody who had sincere refuge in their heart, he would choose the person who had sincere refuge in their heart as the better person to be like. You know, we can see that actually. There are people like who are a university professor, right, who knows a ton about Buddhism but doesn't think, has no refuge. And actually, it doesn't really, from a spiritual point of view, it's not much help to them actually at all. Whereas if you have sincere refuge, it does help you. So that's what Lama Dromdonpa does.
It's more to do with conviction, the faith, rather than anything else.
Yeah, having faith. And then Khenchen Rinpoche says one more point, which he says, which is important. He says refuge, right, this practice of taking refuge, is not mainly, it's not really about just reciting a verse, right, like we did at the beginning. He says that's not the main point of refuge. That refuge has to be in your heart. It's a practice that comes in your heart, from your heart. And actually, and Khenchen Rinpoche oftentimes, when he teaches on refuge, uses a metaphor, an analogy for refuge, where he says the feeling, and I think he's coming from his own experience actually, where he says the feeling of refuge should be like a young child in relation who loves their mother and relies on their mother and feels that feeling, like when they fall down, how they turn to their mother and look, and like reach out. He said he says when you have that feeling in your heart, that's like refuge. So when you think of whether it's Shakyamuni Buddha or Tara or Lama Tsongkhapa or whoever, your object, or the Buddha, ultimately Shakyamuni Buddha. Like when you think of them, of the three jewels, really, we'll get into, but that when the feeling is like that, like a young child for the loving mother, that's when you are making progress in the practice of refuge. That was a quite touching example. And so the first point that Lama Tsongkhapa goes into when he gets into, there are different headlines or different topics that he's going to cover. Actually, the very first line here, it says, I'll just start, where it says, taking refuge in three jewels, and it says, the holy gateway for entering the teachings, training in refuge, right? I'll just start with that. So, gateway for entering the teachings, what does that mean? That's actually from Trijang Rinpoche's outline, right? But there is that, the very entry point to being Buddhist, of course, is taking refuge. And there's a ceremony you can go through, some of you have gone through it, right, where you sort of formally take refuge with the Lama. But again, in order to do that, the ceremony is just, is just the outer structure. You have to have these qualities in your heart, or it's not really taking refuge, right? If you just sit through that ceremony, but if you're thinking about something else, then that's not really taking refuge. If your mind's not in it, your heart's not in it. So it could, because refuge is a state of mind. Right? And then so then Lama Tsongkhapa goes on. I want to cover this point in detail a little bit. So he says there are two causes, right? The first section here is the causes of refuge, on which taking refuge depends. And so there are two causes actually that he points out. One is fear, and the other is faith or conviction. And you have to have both. There is, because if you're not afraid of something, there's no need to take refuge, right? Like in Arizona, you don't have to turn to somebody else or something else for help. And that's the analogy, right? I was just giving the analogy of the child, right? The child who fell down, right? They're suffering in some way and they're scared, right? And that child has trust or faith in their mom, in my analogy, in Khenchen Rinpoche's analogy, right? So, and why does the child have faith and trust in their mother? Is they you know, they have some experience. If the child has been a good mom, right? That child has some faith, like, oh wow, this person's always there for me. They always help me. They put a Band-Aid on. They feed me. They give me a hug. They do all those things, right? And then they're scared, so they turn to the mother, right? And so the idea is that there has to be both qualities: a fear of something, and then trust or faith or conviction that the three jewels can help. And I want to go into even more detail. I want to cover what Lama Tsongkhapa says and then go into more detail. So here, Lama Tsongkhapa says, in the context of what we just contemplated, what's the fear? The fear is of rebirth in the lower realms. And then the faith is the conviction that the three jewels can protect me from that suffering. Does that make sense in that context? Now I want to go into a little more detail because there are actually, there are many ways of taking refuge, and there are also many, like refuge is a huge topic actually. Sometimes people think, oh, it's very introductory. It's actually a humongous topic. So we'll slowly go through some of them, but I want to start with this. There are actually, oftentimes there are three different types of fear discussed. There are three different scopes of from the three scopes. There are three levels of taking refuge in that sense. So one, in the low scope, right, or the practice in common with the low scope, which we all should have, we all need to have, is the fear is of rebirth in the lower realms, and the faith is that the three jewels can help me avoid rebirth in the lower realms. Okay. Now actually, you have to check, why would you have faith in that? Like, why would you have faith that the three jewels can protect you from rebirth in the lower realms? And so this is an important point, right? Because there's the Dalai Lama says we have to actually understand these points in detail, right? Because it's not actually that the three jewels, let's sort of say that's like, are going to give you, let's sort of say, some nectar that's going to protect you from rebirth in the lower realms. And they're not going to give you like a magical amulet that's going to protect you. Actually, even if they give you a magical amulet, your body gets left behind, so it's the amulet, right? So that won't be there with you. If they give you something to drink, that would, well, your body gets left behind, so you can't drink anything. So like that's not how they protect you from the lower realms, right? So how do the three jewels protect from the lower realms? So the idea is that they teach you, right? First of all, how to avoid the 10 non-virtuous actions, right? How not to do negative actions that are the cause of rebirth in the lower realms. They teach you how to purify your karma, right? The teachings, in other words, they teach the practices of purification. They teach the methods for generating positive karma. And so if you check and you say, okay, well, so if I avoid the 10 non-virtuous actions, and I create positive karma, and I purify, I do practice of purification, then I won't have the causes for rebirth in the lower realms, and everything depends on causes and conditions, so I can create the causes for a good rebirth. Right? So then you say, okay, so yeah, that's how the three jewels do that, right? So the Buddha taught that. The Dharma is that teaching, right? That explains this is how you don't. If you don't want to go to the realms, here's what to do: don't kill, don't steal, don't. And then you can go into more detail. Also, don't create these negative states of mind, right? Because we went into that more, right? Don't be greedy, don't be hateful. Don't let your mind go into hatred. Don't let your mind go into arrogance. Don't let your mind go into grasping and so on, because those are the causes, right? So on a gross level, we can say the 10 non-virtues are. On a subtle level, it's these mental states are the cause of lower realms, right? And so you can see, okay, the Buddha taught, right, how to cultivate positive, and then the Buddha taught in detail, how do I cultivate positive states of mind, the antidotes to those, right? How do I cultivate love, patience, tolerance, forgiveness, compassion, and so on. And if those are in my heart, then naturally I don't do those negative actions, I do positive actions. Also, just that state of mind, there, you can see, right? Because those negative lower realms are created by mental states ultimately, right? By hatred, for example. So if I cultivate love, there's no cause in my mind for that. Right? And so we can see, and then gradually by contemplating that, you develop some faith. Okay, that makes sense to me. In other words, I have some trust and faith that the three jewels can protect me. And if I study those teachings, and I have faith, and I sort of practice those teachings, then I won't go to the lower realms. Great, I want to practice that. And that's how one develops that, the beginning of that faith, right? But then there's another level. Lama Tsongkhapa only covers the low scope here, but in the commentary they go into more detail. Then the middle scope has another level of fear, because we've been through 3 scopes of practice, right? So in the middle scope, it's not just the fear of the lower realms. This includes that, right? He said, of course I don't want to go to lower realms. But in the middle scope, one has a fear of continuing to be in samsara, actually. Right? of continuing to have a samsaric existence, where one is controlled by ignorance and afflictive emotions. So one sort of feels, yes, I don't want to go to lower realms, but it's also, that's not enough. I don't want to just keep taking rebirth where I'm like out of control, right? I have a mind that's out of control, I have a body that's out of control, I die over and over again. And also, how do I know I won't take rebirth in the lower realms someday in the future, then, after a number of lifetimes, right? So it's not enough just not to go to lower realms once. I want to actually achieve liberation from samsara. Right? I'm afraid of continuing to be a samsaric being. So then that's the fear, right? The middle scope is the fear of samsara itself. And then the faith is, well, can the three jewels protect me from that, right? And so again, one has to understand then the Four Noble Truths to actually understand that. Does that make sense? Like the Buddha's teaching on the Four Noble Truths. In other words, what's the, so one has to understand, the nature of samsaric suffering, what are the inner causes of that, right? Which are ignorance and afflictive emotions. One has to understand the Buddha's teaching on the Third Noble Truth, that there isn't cessation of suffering, and that there's a path to that cessation, right? The noble path to cessation of suffering. And if one understands those points, one can say, okay, the three jewels are a valid refuge to protect me from the suffering of samsara. And then the ultimate refuge in that sense is the Dharma, which is nirvana, actually, right? The Buddha taught the path to nirvana, and then the Sangha helped one. And the definitive refuge in that sense is nirvana itself, right? And when I achieve that, I'm free from samsara. And so then one practices in that way. Does that make sense? And then in the great scope, of course, there's still a fear, right? The fear includes fear of lower realms, fear of my own continuing in samsara, but there's another level of fear added at this point, which is the fear that others will continue to suffer. Right? So one would feel, yes, I could practice the Four Noble Truths and the three higher trainings, right? Concentration, meditation, and wisdom, achieve liberation of myself. But it's terrifying to think of all mother sentient beings continuing to suffer endlessly. That's the greatest, from a Mahayana Buddhist practitioner, Bodhisattva's point of view, that's actually the greatest fear of all, right? The fear that infinite other beings will continue to suffer meaninglessly. And so then, in a sense, terrified of that the Bodhisattva takes refuge in the three jewels, right? And says, and then they have to believe, right? They have to have some faith that the three jewels have a path to Buddhahood itself, right? By practicing the six perfections and so on, right? And by practicing, which we'll get into later in the text, but by practicing those, then one has some conclusion, I could achieve Buddhahood and therefore liberate others from suffering. And then one takes refuge based on that understanding. So does that make sense? I'm just giving examples of fear. Does that make some sense? So there are three levels of fear. And then I wanted to I'm going to go off on a small tangent for a moment. Which I find that's not entirely intentional. Right? You guys know this, I think, but I think it's worth reflecting on for a moment. That, in a sense, all the time, regularly, right, we take refuge in things other than the three jewels. Right? Whereas so if you think about it, you have to ask yourself, when I'm anxious, when I'm uneasy, when I'm suffering in some way, where do I turn for refuge? Right? What do I have faith in? And then, for some people the answer is alcohol. For some people the answer is drugs. Right? For some people the answer is reality TV shows. I don't know. I'm trying to think of or Haagen-Dazs. I don't know. Well, it depends. As we turn for refuge to all different things, doesn't it? So for some of us, it's actually for some people it's family. Right? My family will protect me. For some people, it's their lover. Right? Oh, this person that's my refuge from in this horrible suffering of samsara. That's my refuge. Right? And if you check introspectively, if each of us checks for ourselves, we probably have a long list of things we take refuge in. I don't think it's just one, actually. And so you check for yourself, like, what do you take, I'm just pointing out, like, this is my tangent for a moment. You can check for yourself, what do I take refuge in when I'm afraid of suffering? And this isn't to blame, the goal I'm just bringing up, the goal here isn't to like blame yourself or attack yourself. We all take refuge in there. And Buddhism is not saying, like, don't eat if you're hungry, right? Like, it's not saying that. It's just saying be aware, right? Like, and to be aware of this, that none of those things are ultimate refuges. Right? Whereas they may be temporary. If you're hungry, having something to eat is a good idea. If there's food available, it's a good thing. And if you're feeling lonely and you have like a good, kind friend, that's nice. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But to remember, those are not ultimate sources of refuge, right? Whereas if, yes, if I'm hungry, I should eat, right? But I'll get hungry again a few hours later. And yes, having a good friend is a good thing, but a little while later I'll be lonely again, or they may die, or they may stop liking me, or they may stop, that's the nature of samsara, right? Is that all samsaric, any relationship to something within samsara, right, that's not the three jewels, is insecure, won't ultimately satisfy the underlying problem. And I just want to say something else about this, because people can misunderstand this point too. So Buddhism isn't saying if you're sick, don't go to the doctor. Yes, of course, go to the doctor, right? In other words, if you think that if it's something a doctor can treat, then go to the doctor, right? And take a temporary refuge in the doctor's treatment, take the medicine or whatever if they have a good treatment plan. And that may cure that disease. What that won't cure is the problem that you'll get sick again, right? And eventually you'll die, and then you'll take rebirth and you'll get sick again. So there's different. So there is a difference between temporary refuges and ultimate refuge. Does that make sense? And what this is addressing is the focus on our basic, right? So those three fears. It's not a fear of a temporary sickness or a moment of feeling lonely, right? It's a fear of the lower realms. It's a fear of samsara itself, or it's a fear of all beings being in samsara. Because what it's saying is to focus on those deeper fears, and then to focus on the ultimate source of refuge, which is the three jewels from those, which is the ultimate source of refuge from those. And that should be the main focus if you're a Buddhist practitioner. Does that make sense? And I remember, when Rebirth was sick, he said, he said this. He said, tell people if they're really sick, they should go to the doctor and follow the treatment plan. He said, and then also they should take refuge and do spiritual practice, and they should do both. He said that's the best approach. If you're hungry, eat something and also do spiritual practice. That's the best approach. Anyway, so I just wanted to pause and sort of reflect on that, right? So here what we're trying to do is gradually train our mind to mainly focus on the ultimate source of refuge. So it's a mental training, right? That we're trying to sort of develop this ability to sort of say our main source, our main concern are these three scopes, right? Are these three different levels of fear. Whereas these other ones are sort of not that big a deal compared to those, right? And then our main source of refuge would be the three jewels. And if I think of can you imagine that? Just pause. Can you imagine having that state of mind where it's of course you do the other things you have to do in life, that they're required, but where in your heart there's that feeling, right? Like the child for the mother, that you think of Tara or you think of the Buddha, right? And you feel that faith as the main sort of thing that gets you through, and the main source, the main relationship actually. Right? And in a sense, that's what also Buddhism is saying, is that, in a sense, one of your main relationships then is to the three jewels. And then it's an actual relationship. Does that make sense? The three jewels are then something you're actually having an ongoing relationship with, right? Where you're listening to them, right? Like a kind parent. They're telling you what to do. They're giving you advice, wise advice, right? If you're suffering, here's how to handle it. And you're sort of listening and you're saying, okay, well, let me practice that. And how can I practice that? And then you turn to them for inspiration also. And for examples, and for guidance, but also for inspiration and for support. That's the Sangha's part, at least, for support. So do you get the idea there? I'm just sort of I'm still on this tangent, but I'm finishing the tangent now. I just wanted to make that tangent to sort of reflect on the emotional side of this, Does that make some sense? Any questions about that before we go on? Yeah.
When you say faith, so we talk about the experience of refuge in the mother. It's based on experience.
Mm-hmm.
And in the early stages of being a Buddhist practitioner, this faith is not really based on experience. At least it's hard to see where that experience is. So what we're really talking about, it seems to me, is the logic of the path. Why this makes sense. And that's where the faith is. And later on, perhaps, you can have faith in your guru because you have seen what can happen, and in the teachings because you can see what happens. But at that early stage, it's not just faith, it's somehow understanding where the path says this will lead you. Or is it the point I want to make?
Yeah, His Holiness makes a similar, His Holiness Dalai Lama in his commentary on this point makes a similar point. I can't remember all the details because he bases it on an analysis from the Lamdre, the Sakya Lamdre. But basically what it was pointing out is that in terms of faith, right, like in terms of experience, an experience of faith, right, that say this, like, what he's really saying is this, is like, in terms of how things, I can't remember all the details of how he presents it, but basically, from a historical point of view, right, like the Buddha had an experience of enlightenment. Then that led to him teaching. Then that led to scriptures being written, right, by Nagarjuna and other great historical teachers. And then those scriptures, like, were passed down, and the teachings were passed down and practiced, and then, then now there are, like, let's say, lamas who teach that, right? And so you're saying from a historical point of view, it's like that. But then he says from an individual point of view, actually, the first thing is you have to meet somebody. You come across a book or you meet a person who's explaining, right, like these things, like the practices, right? And he says then there comes some like intellectual understanding, maybe, right, which is what you're getting at. And then he says, and then if you practice those things over years, is what His Holiness says, then there comes to be some experience. And he says that little bit of experience is actually the real foundation of faith. Is that when you start to practice something that you've learned from Buddhist teachings, and then he points out, he says, then you get a little better, right? Like your mind gets a little better. Is then you start to have some faith. Oh wow, like my compassion's increasing and my anger is decreasing. He says, and then you develop faith. Wow, so if I keep doing this, my anger will keep going down, my compassion will keep going up. And then, like, as that happens, you develop more faith and more faith. And I thought it's fascinating, actually. It says even in like the teachings, it says that like great bodhisattvas, when they achieve these very high levels of realization, that their level of faith increases even more. Like, in other words, that they're still on that path, actually. Of, like, like right now, if I say Buddhahood, it's so far from the day-to-day experience of reality that I have some intellectual idea of it. But what they're saying is like when you achieve some high levels of the path, it's like your understanding of what Buddhahood is changes, and then you develop a deeper faith, and that somebody on our level of experience, it's impossible to have the same level of faith as that person who's had that experience. So I think it's just supporting what you're saying, really.
Actually, he talked about this in London, I think '99, the 4 steps for a layman as opposed to a monk. So you start with a valid scripture, valid testimonial, valid guru, and then the valid experience for the monks. But for us, it's the other way around. For a layman, you need to have a valid experience, and probably you question why such, why such, why did it happen this way, why is it happening to me? And based on that experience, you try to find an answer. And then you have to generate the faith in that answer that you get. Yeah. That was my path.
Yeah, so we have to develop some experience.
Sorry, what kind of experience you're talking about that increase your faith?
Oh, so what His Holiness Dalai Lama is saying is like, he's not talking about anything mystical. What he's saying is like, so let's say a person is an angry person, right? And then if they practice the teachings on patience, and they see, wow, yeah, my anger is getting less. It's working, Or if a person's like quite... Patience, I'm giving an example.
Okay.
Or if like let's say I notice, okay, I start off and I say, wow, the truth is I'm kind of selfish. And then I start practicing meditation on love. And then I say, okay, I'm becoming a little bit more kind person, good-hearted person. That based on that, one develops some experience. Like, okay, my mind's getting a little better. And then one can develop some faith that if I keep practicing, I can keep getting better.
Let the path works.
Yeah, that the practices work.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. It was that kind of experience, not something mystical or like that. Yeah, or same thing, right? Like if my mind tends to be very dissatisfied, like I'm always, like a hungry ghost, but a human hungry, or I'm always like wanting something more and grasping and always feeling agitated and dissatisfied. And then if I practice the teachings on contentment, and then I start to have some experience, wow, like sometimes my mind is a little bit more peace, actually. I have a little more inner peace. I'm actually not so upset or agitated. Then like one has an experience like that, then one says, wow, that works. Okay, because before that, like somebody said it or you read it in a book, it's just like an idea. But then if you have the experience of contentment, right, then that gives you some faith. Oh wow, I can have more and more of that if I practice. Yeah, so it's not mystical, it's like practical. Any other questions? Actually, no, hurry. Any other questions about what we've covered so far? So next, we'll just cover at least this first part about. So next is a section called "What Objects to Take Refuge in." Right? And so now, and it's fascinating. Like if you're Buddhist, right, we say, "Oh, 3 jewels of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha." It seems like those words are familiar, right? We say them. We say, "I go refuge to the Buddha, I go refuge to the Dharma." But actually, I have a question. Like, it's fascinating. I mean, this next section I think is really interesting because so it seems a question. So, what's a Buddha? What's a Dharma? And what's a Sangha? Like, and you start. I mean, it's fascinating, right? Like, that's actually quite a big topic, isn't it? Like, and actually, so if you say I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, like. Do you have a clear idea what is the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha? Actually, especially if you're Buddhist, like, do you have a clear idea of what's the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha? Like, is the Buddha a statue, or is the Buddha? What is the Buddha? I mean, it's actually an interesting question, right? Like, because it's very fundamental, and if we're going to say we're going to have faith in the Buddha. It means we have to have some understanding of what's the Buddha, right? Like, otherwise, how can you have faith in the Buddha? If I just think, well, the Buddha is a person who lived 2,600 years ago in India, I don't know, like, does that, I'm not, like, then I might say, well, how does that help me? Like, if the Buddha is just a person who lived then and died, is it clear? I mean, I have to think, is there some way in which that helps me? Why would I take refuge in them? So I'm just saying we have to check, right? So we're going to explore that now. And now I want to say something I think is just interesting. It's like we just had, I said this a little bit before, but we've just finished the section meditating on the sufferings of the lower realms, hell, hungry ghost, animal, right? And we said like it's a little hard, sometimes it can be hard to imagine those sufferings, and like we have to, right? We imagine like the opposite comes is imagine putting your hand in coals and then think, wow, that whole body like that for eons, and it's like it's almost unimaginable actually, but we have to try to imagine it, right? To suffering the lower realms. I think this next section is actually hard. I think this next section is actually harder to imagine. Is what's it like to be a Buddha? Right? We have to actually imagine that a little bit. What's a Buddha? Right? And I think that's more foreign actually, because like we do suffer a lot actually, like, over the course of our lifetime. And we see a lot of suffering. I mean, if you turn on the news, you see, like, if you say, oh, it's hard to imagine the suffering of hell, but then if you watch the news, like, it becomes a little easier, like, to understand the suffering of hell. And actually, like, the suffering of hungry ghosts, I mean, if you just watch animals and people enough, like, I don't know, it's not that hard, right? Like, or it's like if you see people being burned alive, and I mean, I saw like news, right, where somebody threw acid on somebody. I mean, like. Then it's like these things happen every day on our planet, right? So in a way, the sufferings of the lower realms can seem very hard to relate to. But then if you just look around, it's not that hard, right? Like, there's people who throw acid on somebody and burn them for no reason. Well, then it's like, of course there could be, like, in other words, like, it's like the horror, I mean, the utter horror that's possible is not so foreign, right? And as I said earlier, right, if you look at like a beautiful field, like peaceful, right, and then you see what people do with it, right, like that you can take a beautiful field like that and you can create a place where you torture people. We do that. We humans do that. Like, so it's like, if we do that, then, I mean, that's hell. In a sense, like, that's as close to, you know, it's like we're trying to create hell. You know, like, if you have a beautiful place that you can do anything you want, right, like, and then you create that, it's not that hard to imagine. Like, in other words, we do that. So it's like, almost like we create hell on purpose, you know. Don't we? I mean, isn't that true? I think it's true, actually. You know, if you look at war, right, like, and war is not as bad as torture, right, and cruelty, and then even in homes, right, people are, now, you know, you have to go someplace far away or something, right? You just look at people like, you know, have you noticed that? Like, even in some of the, like, you know, if you get to know, right, like if you enter a house where somebody's abusive and alcoholic or something like that, like, it feels horrible, right? Like, and even though the house could be very nice externally, if you go in and you have that feeling, it's like horrific, right? And so there are many ways in which we create that. And even like in movies, right? Like somebody was saying this, we were joking, I think, right? Horror movies, like there is it's not that hard to think of lower realms also because, like, in our immediate, right? Like, actually, I mean, one is you can look at the news, you can look at human beings, you can empathize with your own, you can look at your own experience. And the other is like our literature, actually, and our movies and our media, right, are filled with like, right, like, I mean, Stephen King wrote so many books, and, you know, they're all like that horror genre every year, right? They come out with like, you know what I'm saying? Like every year they just like it is like either it's the, what is it called, like something set, what is it, like number 7 of that same movie or something, or they also always come up with new ones, right? There's always another, and like sometimes they call it hell something, or they're like, what's it, you know, where they're chopping people up or just like, so like we have lots of examples of that. But now I want to say, like, do we have, I mean, like the idea of a Buddha, though, like of somebody who is totally enlightened, that's really fun, actually. Right? Like, our media has no. I was actually asking this, like, I'm going on a tangent again. Is it okay? Like, I'm going to go off on, like, I was talking to somebody about this recently. I was saying, like, you know, if you think of horror movies, right, like, and of horrible creatures, right, like, whether you think of, like, Hannibal Lecter, right? Like, or Dracula, or Frankenstein, and then there's, like, countless, right? Like, I don't know, I mean, if you think of horror movies, you could make a list of, like, the most horrific, right? They'd be like, what are they all? I don't know. They're, like, you could come up, I mean, if somebody knew those well, you could come up with a list. From literature, you come up with a list of endless examples, right? And then from movies, you come up with a list of endless examples. Then if you try to just think, I mean, even I'm just asking in popular culture, like even, and can you even think of examples of deep wisdom? I'm not talking about enlightened, but just like deeply wise, somewhat enlightened characters. Like, I can only come up with Gandalf and Yoda. It's like, I'm done. I was like, Gandalf, Yoda, I don't know. I kind of got stuck. And they didn't even have Yoda in the New Year Star. You know, Yoda's gone. There's nothing. He's dead. There's nothing left.
Yoda's on my altar.
I mean, there's a real, what's there, lack, and even in Western literature, actually, like, there's almost no, like, there are very, very few examples of deep wisdom. And, you know, I mean, even Shakespeare, when he has a wise, usually, I mean, he'll put wisdom in the mouth of somebody who's somebody will say something, a buffoon, sort of, who suddenly says a wise comment, you know, like, and there is wisdom there, but it's usually like a sort of, almost the person accidentally says something wise, and it's funny. But there are very few, like, deeply wise, so I'm just pointing out, right, and then, it's hard to even say it out loud. If you look in our political arena, it's hard to find deep wisdom. No offense to anybody. But,
Not hard to find any.
Yeah. I was trying to understand. But I'm just saying, like, in our culture, there's not a lot of examples of that. And then in our literature, there's not. And then in our own life, right, like, I mean, if I ask you to, like, make a list of all the suffering you've come across, it would take a really long time, just in your own life, right? If you make, how long would, you know, if you said, okay, now make a list of all the enlightened wisdom you've come across. I don't think it'd be as long necessarily, you know. So all I'm saying is, for us, I think it's hard to even. I think it's actually much harder to imagine this next phase. What's a Buddha? And I'll say one more thing, which is, this is one big advantage. You said layman and monk. Like, this is one big advantage the monks have, actually, is that, like, being raised. If you read, like, I remember one time I started reading the flower ornament scripture. I think it's called the Avatamsaka Sutra, the flower ornament sutra. And I remember, like, it felt like it's a very long sutra. I thought I would read the whole thing, and I read like part of it. I had to stop at a certain point. It was like I was like, this is so unfamiliar. It's like it would be like if all I was going to eat for a week was cream, like heavy cream. It was like that rich. I was like, oh, my system can't take it or something. I had to like slow down because it was so positive. It was like so unbelievably visionary and positive, which is the nature of Mahayana scriptures, really, sutras. And the monks in the monasteries, like, they spend years studying the qualities of the Buddha, the qualities of the Dharma, the qualities of the Sangha, the actions of great bodhisattvas. And so I think they have their imagination is attuned to that. And I'm just saying, I think we have a challenge ahead of us to cover this section on refuge now. So this is my cultural side. Is that I think, like, for most of us, at least, maybe some of you are different, but for most of us, like, we've never cultivated the imagination of what's it like to be enlightened. You see what I'm getting at? And so I think it's going to be a challenge for us because we have like a deficit. Like, we have a spiritual deficit disorder. We don't know how to. We have like some kind of lack of. I think nobody's ever taught us, or we've never even begun to imagine these kind of things much. So I think this is going to be like a journey in a way to even imagine what's in Buddha. And then I want to say, like, Lama Tsongkhapa is very kind. It's almost like he's thinking of people like us. Because he starts off, he quotes a praise in 150 verses. So it's 150 verses praising the Buddha. And I'll just read these two verses. To one in whom perpetually all faults are definitely absent, to one in whom every manner of all positive qualities abide, in case someone like that exists, it's right to take refuge in him, to praise him, to attend on him, and to abide in what he teaches. And so Lama Tsongkhapa is starting Lama Tsongkhapa himself had studied very extensively the qualities of a Buddha, right? But I think he's very gentle with us, so he starts very simply. He's just describing two very simple qualities, and he's saying, and he's doing ones that we should be able to begin to imagine, like even to start, right? So one is, he says, perpetually all faults are absent, definitely absent. Right? So what he's saying there, right? I think he's helping us actually to imagine, right? So he says, I was saying earlier, we can say, okay, I used to be really angry, and now I'm a little less angry. I used to be like very desirous and sort of dissatisfied, and now sometimes I have 5 minutes where I'm a little bit satisfied. Like, we can imagine that, right? We can say, okay, that's possible, right? And now he's saying, now based on that little bit of experience, imagine somebody, right, who perpetually means all the time, right? All the time. All faults are, and not just absent, but definitely absent, and not just some faults, right? So you have to pause and say, wow, can I imagine that? All faults are definitely absent all the time. Right? And if you just pause to imagine, what would that be like? What would it be like to be a being like, he's describing a Buddha, of course, right? So he's saying one quality of a Buddha is that perpetually all faults are definitely absent. So I'm asking you to empathize for a moment. Like, can you empathize with the Buddha's experience of that? It's almost, right, it's like, can you even begin to imagine what that would be like? So, like, say, okay, I'm a little less angry, but can you imagine, like, a Buddha is somebody who, if somebody comes up and, like, whacks him with a sword, he doesn't have the instinct to get angry. He doesn't even have it's not like he has to practice patience. There's no beginning of anger. Like, I could maybe imagine somebody who's well-trained enough that they could practice patience in that. That'd be hard to imagine. But can you imagine somebody where there's no instinct to anger or retaliation? And can you imagine somebody who, like, there's no instinct towards craving for anything. Like, so they're always satisfied. You know, can you imagine? So there's just a free of all faults, right? Definitely absent. Right? So it's saying, imagine that, right? Imagine somebody who has no, like, and then another kind of fault is the fault of not knowing. Right? So that, like, there are so many things I don't know. Right? The Buddha is free from those defects. So the Buddha knows. Right? The Buddha knows conventional phenomena and knows the ultimate truth about phenomena at the same time. So I just say, wow, it's hard to imagine. That's I'm just positive, right? And then he says, and who knew every manner of all positive qualities of life, right? So there he's saying, right, like, okay, I have a little bit of loving kindness, right? But for the Buddha, like, they're in a constant state of infinite loving kindness, right? And, like, it's hard to imagine. For me, I just say, when I try to imagine that, I think of, like, actually think of times I've seen people who are, like, in a completely filled with hatred and rage. They're like where their eyes are bulging. They look like their head's gonna pop off. Then they like want to rip somebody apart. You know, because I've seen that. I've seen hatred. You know, like at least. I was like, can I imagine somebody who has who has a comparable level of love, but continually? Wow, it's hard to imagine. Right? Like somebody who's experienced. Now they don't look bulging or they're not upset. Right? They're peaceful. Love is peaceful. But like somebody who, as soon as like everything they do, as soon as they do anything, they're completely overwhelmed. Like their continual flow of love is infinite. So like for them, the entire universe is like overflowing with love. Right? Like their love the universe can't contain it. And the same with their compassion. I'm just pausing, like I'm giving a few examples, right, of what if we reflect on what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here. And so I think that is quite appropriate. He says, it's almost funny, right? He says, in case someone like that exists, right? Because he's saying for beginners like us, it's almost hard to, it's acknowledging, it's almost hard to imagine, right? That somebody could have every single positive quality, right? Like again, wisdom, right? Like, can we even, I mean, I was like saying, like, can we even imagine somebody who's a little bit wise, right? It's a little hard to imagine, right? But then like, the Buddha has all positive qualities are completed, right? So their wisdom is complete. There is, in the sense that they have an infinite amount of wisdom. Right? Is it imaginable? Right? So he's saying, in case someone like that were to exist, right? He sort of, I mean, I think this verse is very gently entering into this section, where it's saying, like, I know that for ordinary, it's like almost like this verse is saying, I know that for ordinary people it's hard to imagine this. So let's start like that, right? In case there were such a being as that, who had no negative qualities, and whose positive qualities were limitless and perpetual, it's saying, yeah, it really would make sense to take refuge in them, right? It would make sense to, you know, it's like, so can you imagine? I'm just going to pause there. Can you imagine that? What's a Buddha? So he's starting to get it. What's a Buddha like?
No.
What's that?
No.
I remember, actually I'll share a story. I think I'm doing a lot of tangents, but I'll just share a story. I remember once, my father, he's passed away, my father, but he was in a wheelchair at the time. He had multiple sclerosis, and I made a prayer wheel to offer to the Dalai Lama. And he wasn't Buddhist, but because he was able to go up to the front because he had a wheelchair, so I said, offer this, and I thought it would be great for my father to get to offer. So I said to him, offer the prayer wheel to the Dalai Lama. And so my father wheeled himself up, and he offered the prayer wheel to the Dalai Lama, which was very touching. But then my father said, you know, he wasn't Buddhist, he wasn't like interested in that kind of stuff particularly, but he came because I was, for me. And he said, he's a really nice guy, like my mom. That Dalai Lama. You know, so he's a good guy, like my mom. I was like, you know, that was my dad trying to get it. Like it was like, it's like trying to empathize with what's somebody like that like. You know, it's the closest analogy you can come up with was that. You know, I think it's actually a fair beginning point. Right? It was like, who else had been really kind to my dad? His mom. You know, it's like, you know, it's hard for us to imagine. My point is, like, we're all like that. It's hard to imagine. Right? It's hard to imagine what's in Buddha.
Maybe the 10 powers of Buddha would be something.
Oh, we're going to go through all that. Yeah,
that would tell like the Oni signs, the working of karma, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, we're going to go through some of those qualities of the Buddha. Well, not today, next time. So then Lama Tsongkhapa says, thus, if someone has the intelligence to differentiate between what is a refuge and what is not a refuge, it is appropriate for him or her to take refuge in the undeceiving protector, the Buddha, Bhagavan. This is also characterized as the Dharma jewel and the Sangha jewel. Right, so what he's saying is that we have to, and this is what we're going to cultivate, this is what we're starting to try to cultivate together, is the intelligence to differentiate what is an ultimate refuge, right? Otherwise, we could just take refuge in whatever, reality TV shows or something, right? Or like, whatever, I don't know, just take refuge in, you know, like, or in just like, whatever, like, what is the latest, you know, like sometimes you try to take refuge in like, what's it, like, I sometimes think like, you know, where like then one year they say, oh, eat low-fat food. And they say, oh, low-fat food's a really bad idea. You should eat regular food. Then they say, don't eat any, you know, eggs. And then now they say eggs are really good for you. You should eat like, you know, which is okay. It's just, you know, whereas that's the state of science, which is always changing. Right? They're always trying to figure out something, and they make mistakes, and then they make new hypotheses, and they do more tests. And so what this is saying is, how do we have how do you cultivate the intelligence to find an ultimate refuge? And if we don't have that, of course, then we like. Actually, you know, then our taking of refuge won't be very deep. Right? We may say it's still a verse because we say, "Oh, I'm Buddhist," or "I come to a Buddhist class." I'll say, "I go refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha." You know, but the more we can understand what is a Buddha, what is Dharma, what is Sangha, then the deeper our practice of refuge will be. Any questions about that or comments before we go on? Because again, I want to go slow anyway, it's no hurry. This topic, it's a deep topic.
Actually, I had something to share with you, Dr. Lawrence.
Okay.
So, the more and more the afflictive part you give up, it almost seems like the more and more you become aware of it when it reflects on somebody else. Is that true? So when we earlier discussed about suffering, so less and less anger you have, the more and more propensity you have to see anger in somebody else before it rises, or you have some sort of notion saying, yeah, you get that keen awareness almost. This is ignorance, this is attachment, this is this. Almost feel at that level at this point.
You mean where you're seeing those qualities in other people?
Yeah, as soon
as they arise.
Sometimes even before it arises. The awareness becomes keener and keener.
And then what do you do?
And you absolutely know it's a suffering, you want to help it.
That's beautiful.
But it's a disturbing part of how do you really get there.
Yeah, I'm just pausing because I was thinking like the Dalai Lama, of course, and the teachings say it's more important to see our own, of course. But yeah, I mean, of course, the more we understand ourselves, it's easier to understand ourselves too.
There's always been a trap with Dharma practitioners, especially new ones. So when we first went to Kopan, for example, people started to learn the Dharma. It's quite common to have people pointing out others' faults in how they weren't pure practitioners, and how they were greedy and angry and this and that. I mean, but it was just part of the environment of new practitioners.
Which is always very helpful, isn't it? So you always really like hearing somebody else come along and point out your fault. Increases popularity quite a bit, I'm sure.
You talked about examples. I think, you know, since I believe the Buddha is a transformational and redemptive kind of process, entity, you know, in our culture there are religious stories, even not in our religion, that demonstrate very positive qualities. And you see in your day-to-day life people who just momentarily, but who exhibit sort of transformation or rising above. And for me, those are both good examples to use. That's not the ultimate goal, but just that it's possible, right? It is possible to be better. Just a point.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, maybe because we don't really have time to go into a whole next section, so maybe I'll just share a couple reflections. Like, you know, one thing we'll cover in some more detail is that we'll cover, like, you know, there are various qualities of Buddha, and then they talk. You guys, some of you have heard of this, right? There's the teaching on sometimes they talk about either 2, 3, or 4, depending on how you categorize it. But they talk about kayas, like body. Kaya means body, right? Like, so you hear like Dharmakaya, you know, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya, which, you know, kaya means body, right? So it could be like truth, some of they translate truth body, enjoyment body, emanation body, something like that. Right? So again, those are just like, what's it say, language or tools to try to. There are many different ways that Buddhist texts describe what a Buddha is, right? So one of them is that, right? These different kayas, right? And so, right. So I mean, so the Buddhas start with the Dharmakaya. Right? So they say this is the description of a Buddha's mind, right? And then sometimes they separate that out into the nature body, and different ways to describe it. But in brief, actually, the Dharmakaya, right, is in essence, I guess I would say is this: is that imagine, so the Dharmakaya, right, the Buddha's mind, simultaneously knows the ultimate truth of phenomena, and they say is omniscient. So it means that it pervades all of existence. It's the Buddha. This is a formal Buddhist teaching. So it means anything that is existent, right? The conventional phenomena. So, I mean, there is everyday, dependently arisen phenomena that exist. They say the Buddha's awareness includes them, and at the same time, the Buddha's awareness includes the emptiness, the ultimate nature of the phenomena. Like, I don't know. I just like, can you imagine? Like, it's I mean, that's unimaginable, actually. Like, so because existent phenomena includes mental states, right? So, like, in other words, like, each of us in this room is having a different mental state right this moment, and then there's all the other stuff around us. It's actually, I mean, just to imagine being aware of everything that's existing in this room at this moment, right? All the mental states of each of us. If there are any non-visible beings that we talked about, right? Those two, hungry ghosts or something, I don't know, demigods or something, right? And their mental states, and then all the other phenomena, right, in this room. I mean, I don't know. I would say, like, it's almost unimaginable just to imagine that in this room. Of course, it's a pretty small room compared to the universe. So I'm just pausing to note, like, it's really hard to imagine, right? What is the Buddha? And maybe I'll ask you guys, and maybe I'll ask you guys one more question, I guess, just for your input on something, which is, since we covered the lower realms and tried to imagine the worst sufferings, right? This issue about the nature of a Buddha is the opposite. It's sort of, you know, and remember I said also Buddha nature, right? Means the mind is empty of inherent existence. It also means the mind can develop, right? So which actually, the fact that we have Buddha nature, right, means that we can also create hell, right? Whereas we don't stay as we are, or we can become a Buddha, or we can create hungry ghosts experience. We can, you know. And I gave that analogy, right? You can take a place, right, and you can turn it into a wonderful place, or you can turn it into a horrific place. Right? Even your own home, right? You can turn your home. If you really want to, you can turn it into someplace horrible. Right? Or you can turn your home into a wonderful place that makes other people joyful just to be there. Well, the same with your mind, right? And that's an analogy, right? So you can create the most horrific suffering or the most sublime, enlightened, qualities with your mind. So anyway, that's one point, right? And then, so we started exploring that. I have a question for you guys, which is, so Lama Tsongkhapa now, in the next section, which we'll go into next class, which is in 2 weeks. Again, next week I'm Connecticut. So I want to give you guys two options, and you choose. One would be, we'll just go through the qualities Lama Tsongkhapa mentions. The other option is we can add on something you were mentioning, the 10 qualities. There's actually a list of many different, like, so for example, Lama Tsongkhapa says the Buddha is free from all fears. Then there's a formal definition of the 4 fearlessnesses, for example, which I can explain, mention in the book and explain a little bit. My question is, do you want, what Lama Tsongkhapa gives is a fairly brief description of a Buddha's qualities. We're not going to, I mean, they're humongously complex. They're ones that would take years to cover. We're not going to try that. But are you guys, I mean, we could just stick with Lama Tsongkhapa's description, which is fairly brief, or we could supplement it a little bit with these other descriptions. Would that be interesting? Okay, so we'll do that a little bit. To me, just as an effort to sort of imagine what's the Buddha. Does that make sense? Even actually, I'll just share one more reflection. I'll stop. Like last night, I was just contemplating this. I was reading the descriptions. One of the descriptions. I was just reading one, for example. The description of the karmic causes for this. But they say, like, so a Buddha has, like, very beautiful hands with long fingers. Their fingers are particularly long, and instead of having lines like ours, a Buddha is born where their natural lines are in the shape of an 8-spoke Dharma wheel on both hands and on both feet. So instead of having, I don't know. So what if a palm reader comes across a Buddha? They're like, okay, that's actually in ancient India. They say that actually that's a sign of either you're going to be born as if somebody's born with, if a child's born with those signs, it said they're either going to be a universal monarch or a Buddha, right? So they naturally have these kind of markings on, and it goes into the causes of that in a past life. And then it said when a Buddha spreads their fingers apart, they have separate. Each of their fingers is separate, like they could wear a ring, but between their fingers are like light. Light naturally appears in their hands as they move their hands around. And again, there's a karmic cause of that. And I was going again. I was like sort of pausing, and I was like, it's like, can you imagine that? I was like, wow, can I imagine coming across somebody where that's the appearance? It's just been interesting stuff. So anyway, okay, so we'll supplement it a little bit just for imagination or something, to imagine what's enlightenment to us. So the supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends.